So yeah, I guess we're gonna do the thing. Cool. So this is my talk. This is room design strategies for procedural Metroidvania dungeons with me. So who am I? Oh, hopefully that presenter view will go away soon. Who am I? This is approximately me. My name is Aaron Inc. My pronouns are they, them. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the United States. I'm a software engineer by day, and then by night and on weekends, I make art. I make music, mostly like electric guitar stuff and some like electronic music. I draw stuff sometimes, including this picture of me, and sometimes I make games, or more realistically, I make game. I'm a huge Metroidvania fan, to the point that I named myself after this genre. And for the last 5 years or so, I've been working off and on in my free time on a procedural Metroidvania game that looks something like this. It doesn't have a name yet. And also, that's a stock character sprite. But we're not going to get too much into my specific game here. It's more going to be about the things that I've learned about trying to make a game like this over the last couple of years. So the first question we have to answer is, what's a procedural Metroidvania? And this all started for me because I played and like platinum trophy 100%ed Rogue Legacy and loved it, but wanted it to be more like Super Metroid. But procedural Metroidvania has like two words in it, right? It has procedural in it, which just means in this case, the content is generated by a computer instead of by hand. There are procedures that humans can do to make games, but like that's nearly all games. So in this case, we specifically mean the computers doing the work. And generally, these procedural games tend to be intended to be more replayable. From the Metroidvania side of things, these are sometimes called search action games, which I think is a really descriptive title. They're about exploring a space, finding upgrades, and beating bosses. And what's important about them to me is that the world is interesting, it's interconnected, and it grows with you, which means that as you play more of the game, you get upgrades that unlock more of the space to explore. And for me, you might have seen a preview of it just there because I clicked the wrong button. I wanted to make sure that that process of backtracking and getting lost and finding your way through this, like what's essentially a sort of maze, was fun. And one of the ways that I can think of doing that was to make the moment-to-moment gameplay of actually traversing through those spaces as fun as I can. And so I'm actually drawing a lot of inspiration from games like Celeste, and from the platformer genre as a whole, right? Where movement is really fun, that we incentivize expression through the mechanics, and we reward mastery over those mechanics as you play. Celeste is actually a really, really good candidate for this because it's already set up with some light exploration and backtracking stuff. The rooms are already built into these like little single screen or multiple screen spaces. So I think it's a really good tool to have in the toolkit. So I think the hardest part of generating a Metroidvania dungeon is getting the right dungeon feel, which is a really like wibbly wobbly squishy term. But I'm gonna do my best to tell you what I think the Metroidvania dungeon feel is about. So here's a picture of the Super Metroid dungeon, or the world map. Thanks Falcon Zero. I have used this map so many times. And so the immediate things that occur to me that are important to me about a dungeon like this. It's big and interconnected and complex, which I think this map obviously is. It's shapely, which is kind of a gross word, but I really just mean it has a pleasing overall shape, which is hard to define, but I think you'll know it when you see it. That's mostly communicated to the player through the map and the mini-map, because they're never going to see the whole dungeon rendered in-game at the same time, right? The map is separated into discrete areas, so the world is broken up into zones, and then those zones are broken up into rooms. Zones are usually differentiated by having different tile sets, different graphics, different art or sound effects or enemies. Maybe they have a different item that you only ever use in that one zone. And then rooms are usually separated by camera transitions. So when you're in one room, you can only see the bounds of that room. When you transition, the camera transitions with you, and then you can only see what's in that new space. And it's really important for me that these separate areas feel distinct while still being physically connected to one another. And this is actually one of the most challenging constraints in the entire problem, because generating random spaces that all fit into an actual physical map is really challenging. Another important part of the Metroidvania dungeon formula is gated exploration. So your power-ups are expanding the playable area, When you get a new power-up, it usually opens up a new place that you can explore, and these power-ups should make the game more fun. We have a word for power-ups that expand the world but don't make the game more fun. Those are called keys. And keys are really useful tools for prototyping your dungeon generation, but they're not particularly fun for players. The exploration of this space should also feel non-linear. The upgrade progression in Super Metroid is actually completely linear. The order in which you have to get all the necessary upgrades without sequence breaking is pretty much fixed. But the order that you move through the rooms is not, right? You're going to go back and forth through rooms several times. You're going to do some backtracking, and that part is really important. There should be some optional content. So these are things like secrets and challenges and upgrades that you don't have to do but might make your experience better. And they should be completable, which to me just means that if I see something in the world that feels like I should be able to interact with it and do something with it, I should be able to, right? So if I see a door, I should be able to at some point go through the door. So we know kind of the feel that we're going for. How do we actually build a dungeon that works like this? And the answer is that's probably a question for another talk, but I'm going to briefly talk about the thing that builds dungeons, right? And we usually call that a dungeon generator. And a dungeon generator is really just a thing that places rooms to build the dungeon. Its responsibilities are things like the size and shape of the dungeon. It's picking which rooms to place where. It's responsible for the balance of the dungeon. So not just gameplay balance of like how hard specific rooms are, but also things like how vertical or horizontal is the dungeon? Like how many big versus small rooms are there? How many rooms are about combat versus platforming versus exploration? It's responsible for the pacing of the dungeon. So how long after you get an item will it take you to find the place where you're supposed to use it? So that's both the distance that you have to travel to find the next place to go, but also how many wrong turns are there? How many branches? It's also fundamental for that fundamental sort of Metroidvania narrative, right? Where you're supposed to get an item and then find a place to use that item and explore more of the dungeon. That narrative is really, really important, and it's something that you can't really do on a room-by-room basis. This has to be done by the generator. But what's important here is that the generator is really only as good as the rooms that it has to work with. The rooms are what actually determine the moment-to-moment gameplay. They determine the look and feel of the game. And so this talk specifically is going to be about how do we design those rooms in such a way that they make the dungeon generator's job easier, or in some case, just make it possible? Because this is a really challenging constraint problem. Oops, I have a out of order thing in this slide. Oh well. So let's talk about the anatomy of a room, right? Rooms kind of look like this, right? So they're a screen, they have some content in them like terrain, maybe they have enemies and other stuff that the player can interact with. In a dungeon generator setting, they'll usually also have some subunits, which are like the map positions that are occupied by this room. And then they'll have openings, which are connections between this room and other rooms in the map. And the nice thing we can do with rooms like this is we can sort of copy and paste them as templates to build out our dungeon. Rooms can also be generated. I would call that a room generator that works alongside a dungeon generator. We're not going to be talking about generated rooms in this talk because templated rooms was the strategy that I decided to go with for building my particular game. So we know that we need to build some rooms that the generator can use to build the dungeon. What makes a good room? And I think there are different metrics to look at for the player, the generator, and the designer. As far as the player is concerned, good rooms should be fun. And there's a lot of things that make rooms fun. I think they should have a strong internal narrative. So it's clear, like the room has a clear sort of purpose, right? You're supposed to go up to this top left area here, grab that gem, fall down, dash to the right. And there's different ways to interpret the narrative of that room, but it stands on its own, right? Rooms should feel intentional so that when you put a room in a spot in the dungeon, it feels like it was supposed to be there. And then there's some situational stuff that rooms should be better at based on how you're using them. So some rooms might want to be challenging or atmospheric. Maybe they're supposed to feel spooky or scary. And some rooms should be memorable. The generator mostly cares about whether rooms are flexible. So the generator wants rooms to have like as many options as possible. So the room should be useful in many places. They should create new opportunities for the generator to make cool stuff, which is very different from how a player would look at a good room. For the designer, which in this case is just me, I want my rooms to be expressive so that I can make cool stuff with them. And I also want them to be really easy to design and build and test and iterate on, so that I can make changes to them, get them in the game really fast, and play with them, because there is no chance that I'm getting these room designs right on the first try ever. So with that, with the idea of like we're trying to make good rooms so that we can make good dungeons that feel like Metroidvanias, here are some strategies that I've developed over the last couple years to try and do this better. So let's start with something really, really straightforward. We want to try and hide the seams. So seams are things that remind the players that the world wasn't designed for them by hand. And there's some really figurative ways to interpret this advice, but let's start with something completely literal. So we have rooms with tiles in them that sort of make up the terrain of the room. These tiles can look at the tiles that are next to them and figure out what sprite to display to make it look like an overall connected shape, right? But we have this problem where the edges of the room don't have any tiles outside of them, right? And so we get that edge behavior all along the edges, or the like in this case, you have little stones that are along the edges. In isolation, this looks a little weird. With another room next to it, it starts to be like really concerning, right? Because these two rooms don't feel like they're connected, because they're not. The tiles in both of the tile maps in these two rooms can't see each other. But there's a really easy hack that we can use to make these rooms feel like they actually connect. We can just tell the tiles, if you're looking for a tile in a position that's outside the bounds of the room, pretend that you found it and set your sprite accordingly. And that one tiny change instantly melds these two rooms together in a way that would never have worked if we didn't have that little hack in there. So little things like that can make a huge difference in how connected the world actually feels. And this theme of like cheating a little bit to make things feel connected when they're actually not is going to come up again. Another general piece of advice is to just start somewhere, right? So when I started working on this project, my rooms looked like this. They were rectangles with numbers on them that I just kind of like threw into Unity in these contiguous blobs that were meant to represent the dungeon. And it wasn't particularly fun. It wasn't interesting. You couldn't even play through it, but it was a start, right? And one of the things that helped me realize was that I really wanted this to look like a Metroidvania dungeon first and foremost, to feel like a Metroidvania dungeon. And so I did that the most obvious way that I could think of, which was to take screenshots of Metroidvania games and draw colliders on them and use those as my room templates. So shout outs to Rogue Legacy and Super Metroid for being the first versions of my rooms, I guess. And I actually took these things and kind of mashed them together into these weird, like, amalgam chimera dungeons. And funny enough, I took a screenshot of these dungeons and sent it to Cellar Door Games, the people who made Rogue Legacy, and they actually responded. Teddy Lee answered a ton of my questions about dungeon generation and room designs, and it was super helpful and kind of inspiring and reassuring to have somebody who had made something that I really admired look at my work and go, yeah, you're like kind of on the right track, like keep going. And so this kind of leads me to one of the first rules of like building a dungeon like this, which is that your openings between rooms need to align. So to move between any two openings, they have to line up. If, you know, one room has a wall where the other room has an opening, you're going to have a problem. And so the general strategy for this, the one that I started with, is to place openings at fixed positions on your walls, right? And this works, and this is actually why this Metroidvania or Super Metroid Rogue Legacy mashup works, is because they both make the same fundamental assumption. Exits are kind of in the middle of your walls. I think I had to tweak them a little bit to get them to actually fit so you could walk between them, but like it pretty much works, right? And this works, but it has a couple downsides. It feels pretty rigid. The rooms themselves feel kind of rectilinear. Openings centered in the ceiling feel really kind of strange, and it doesn't work well when you have multiple rooms in a row. It just feels very weird. And it's also really heavily restrictive on your room designs. So my first double jump item room, if we're doing a double jump item room like in Super Metroid, where you have to get the item to escape the room, we want to fall down so that we have to jump high enough to get back out of it that we need the double jump. But if your fixed position exit is in the middle of the wall, you have to like make stairs up to a point that's far enough up that you can fall back down. And it's just a little weird. And so my strategy for dealing with this, one of the strategies that kind of sort of worked was to break rooms into subunits, right? So instead of having one screen be one unit in the map, each screen essentially gets 8 subunits, 4 by 2, and that lets us have more options for placing those openings, right? So your openings are, you have 2 spots on the sides and 4 spots on the ceilings. But it has some downsides. One is that the map now has 8 times more subunit positions in it, which can be a pretty significant performance impact on things like pathfinding through the dungeon, which is the thing I use in dungeon generation. The rooms themselves can kind of become misaligned, or at least the screens can. And so I had to make these 1x1 connector rooms that would join together into hallways between the rooms. And those caused even more problems. They didn't feel particularly good. Hallways connecting rooms is a sort of tried and true strategy for top-down roguelike games, but it feels a little strange in a side-scrolling platformer. But really, the big problem was, what should the camera do when you enter one of these hallways? Because they're not full screens. Should it just go into free camera mode and show you everything, but then like you might see stuff between the rooms that you shouldn't have been able to see? Should it attach to the room you just came through, but then like that attachment camera stuff gets really strange or complicated? And another sort of petty problem is that the minimap was really ugly because the minimap was styled after the Super Metroid minimap, or overall map, and having each one of these rooms be 8 units in it just felt really strange. So I actually sat with this for months, right? And it took me it actually sort of stopped development on the game for a while. A lot of these things have come out of me basically giving up on making this game and then coming back to it a while later with some idea that suddenly made actual, like, the generation of room designs work. And this was one of those things. So apologize to people in the Proc Jam Discord who have already seen this GIF. What's going on here? And what's happening is these rooms don't actually align anymore, right? We're sort of having the rooms slide into place if their exits don't perfectly match. And this sort of gives us the best of both worlds, right? It puts the exits anywhere along the edge. We can connect any screen with an opening to the right, with any screen with an opening to the left. And we just sort of have to hope that nobody notices, or in my case, make a GIF and ask people what they see in it. And of course, a lot of the Proc Jam people immediately understood what was going on. But it seemed to go over pretty well. So I ended up implementing this in the actual game, doing something like this. So openings on rooms have an offset from their subunit. So this is how far they are from either the bottom or the left, depending on what direction they are. You disable rooms that you're far away from so that they don't collide essentially in world space with other rooms. When you're near an opening, you activate it and align it with its sibling. And then it just kind of works. This actually works a lot like chunking, where you're only loading in the part of the games that you actually are looking at, but it means the world positions of rooms kind of drift over time. It's really hard to notice this drift in play, but it broke a bunch of my tools for editing and modifying these rooms, right? But I think it actually works pretty well. So here's what it looks like in practice. This is actually the same image from the start of the talk. You probably didn't notice that I was doing some fairly aggressive non-Euclidean room alignment stuff. It just kind of feels like you're playing a Metroidvania, which is exactly what I wanted. I think that free movement between those rooms and a minimap and a smooth camera transition all really help to sell the illusion. It makes the minimap look kind of weird when you look at it all at once. But the advantages are massive, right? You get really, really flexible exits, but you also get this really easy to understand, like, Euclidean grid that all the rooms sort of theoretically sit in the map, even though their actual play in practice is sort of non-Euclidean. And if you're looking really closely, you can tell that the spaces between, when you go in loops in the dungeon, don't really work right. But it's very, very hard to notice. Another concept that it took me a while to sort of figure out, and this is where that platformer influence is coming in, is that going up should be fun. gravity is an invisible constraint on all of your rooms if you're making a side-scrolling sort of Metroidvania platformer thing. And you really should be asking yourself from the very beginning, how is the player going to gain height, both to move from the floor of a room to the ceiling if they need to get up there and go through an opening in the ceiling, but also like between rooms. And the standard answer to this is to just jump on stuff, right? And this works. You can build terrain, kind of like a stair step, or things on either side of a long vertical column that you can jump on. You can also add these one-way platforms that are kind of ubiquitous in a lot of games. Rogue Legacy uses a ton of these. But I didn't really like these solutions. They also added a bunch of constraints to my rooms, right? Because if you're going to add terrain, you need space to add that terrain. And these one-way platforms just feel a little bit incongruous to me with the overall like navigation and traversal mechanics that I wanted. So I decided that instead I could just give the player a fun ability, like stealing stuff directly from Celeste, a directional dash, or a wall jump, that they would always have, that isn't part of the progression items narrative, but that lets me just make the assumption in all of my rooms that the player has this ability to go up pretty much as far as they need to. And if I need to block them from doing this, I can build stuff that blocks them. So spikes, in this case, you can't wall jump off of, which keeps you from wall jumping infinitely in a room that I need you to use some other kind of item to get up through. Another like ubiquitous constraint in dungeons like these is that every opening needs to go somewhere. The generator needs lots of openings to build good dungeons. It needs lots of options. And so here are two rooms from two different zones that are right next to each other that each are like fully decked out with openings. But the problem is you need to do something with those unused openings once generation is done. They can't just go nowhere. So, okay, we can cap them with a dead-end room and just, like, put some treasure in there or something. But what happens if we cap one with a dead-end room, but then another opening from another room tries to point into the same space? We have that same problem before of openings opening into walls. And this is a fundamental problem with trying to take rigid rooms and map them onto any configuration that they weren't designed to work with. If any of you have played the Celeste randomizer, this is exactly the thing that you run into with it, where you have a lot of exits and rooms that just don't go anywhere. And this was my solution to that, which are things that I call modular rooms. So the openings in the room have multiple barriers to choose from. They can be open, which means you can go between them freely no matter what items you have. They could be a wall, which means you can't go through them no matter what. Or they could be something item specific, right? So if you have keys, you can build a door. If you have a breakable wall, you can get through it with bombs. As an aside, breakable walls and bombs are also kind of just a lampshaded key, unless you find some other way to make them fun. You could also have a tall ledge that requires you to double jump to get over it, right? We disallow openings in the dungeon that require items that aren't in the dungeon, right? Because of that completability requirement that we said was part of dungeon feel. And we can take basically any opening and disable it by making it a wall, which means we no longer have to cap all of these rooms with extra stuff. And this works pretty well. Let's look at what happens when we remove some openings by setting them to walls in this room. So if we remove the top and the bottom openings, this room still kind of makes sense. It's kind of boring because I've been spending all of my time making the slides for this talk instead of actually working on my game, but it still works, right? You can wall jump up the left-hand side and go to the right, or go in the opposite direction. But if you remove the top and the left openings, this room starts to feel pretty strange because all that geometry on the left side of the room doesn't have a purpose anymore. And so I tried to solve this problem in a number of ways. The most promising one was to like put chests or some kind of treasure in the room to like, make it okay that there was a space that didn't serve any purpose. So like putting a chest at the bottom right or bottom left here. But it never quite felt right. It didn't feel like it followed the Metroidvania formula all that well. And so the solution that should have been clear to me much earlier was to just have some openings that are still mandatory, right? Openings are mandatory if they can't be walls. And mandatory exits are really important because they ensure that the narrative of the room is still intact no matter what configuration it's in. So we can create mandatory exits intentionally as we're designing a room to give it purpose and structure. And then we can create optional exits that create more options for the generator. So again, we have this best of both worlds thing going on, where the generator gets what it wants by having really, really flexible rooms, but the player also gets what they want, and the designer get what they want by having rooms that are fun and expressive. This has the same challenges as before, because previously, when all of the openings could only be openings, right, that was the same as having them all be mandatory. So we have to do some stuff with the generator to make this work, but there are much fewer of them, which makes it a much, much easier problem to solve. So here's some examples of rooms with mandatory exits, where the mandatory exits define sort of the overall flow of the room, and then we can essentially add more exits as we need to during generation to build out the dungeon. And again, this is with a more horizontal room. The narrative sort of sticks even though we're swapping out a bunch of the openings. So the next challenge that we need to deal with is, how do we do that Metroidvania narrative thing where we block your path forward through the dungeon until you get the items that we want you to get? In general, the strategy for this is to choose an opening somewhere in the dungeon as it exists right now that we're going to say, this is the path to the new part of the dungeon. We treat that as like a choke point. We set it to a matching barrier that you can only get through with the item that you want. And that, in theory, works, except how do you guarantee that that opening exists somewhere in your dungeon? So here's an example of a really tiny dungeon with 3 rooms in it, the start room on the right, an item room with a double jump in it on the left, and then a sort of path room in the middle. And in this case, we only have 3 openings, and neither of them are configurable to be blocked by a double jump. And in general, it's hard to guarantee that you have an opening somewhere in your dungeon that's close enough to where you are to maintain pacing that you can definitely block on the item you want. And again, this was a problem that nearly killed the entire game, right? And blocked me for months. And eventually, I realized I should just do what Metroidvania games do. Oh, I got a little ahead of myself. The first solution that I came up with was to make every room an everything room, right? So most openings have barriers for every item in the game. And this works for the dungeon, right? Because the dungeon just wants things to be flexible. You can take any opening and say, I want this to be a double jump thing or a door thing. The problem is it's a room design nightmare for a number of reasons. For every item that you add to the game, you have to add new barriers to every one of your rooms, or at least enough of your rooms that your dungeon generator doesn't start failing. And this is extremely exhausting, and it disincentivizes adding new items to the game, which is a thing you should feel good about doing because it's going to make your game more fun in a game that's all about getting random items and progressing through the game with them. It's also just not always possible to add a new barrier into a space that was intended for something small. Like if you have a door, it's very hard without changing the rest of the room to add room to have like a double jump gap or a really tall wall or something like that. It discourages you from adding more exits because every time you add an exit, it's a huge pile of work. And you have fewer options for the generator overall because you're not making as many exits as you used to be. You also just spend more time making fewer, worse rooms, and that's it ended up making the game not very fun at all because I was drifting away again from feeling like a Metroidvania dungeon because none of the rooms had a narrative, none of them had purpose. And so my solution to this, as I hinted at accidentally before, is to specialize rooms. So we can create specialized rooms for each new item that we create, make more rooms, but each of those rooms will be easier to design and they'll be better for it. The generator is responsible for placing those specialized rooms in places where they're necessary. And so we'll go over some examples for double jump. So we already know about item rooms. Those are a kind of specialized room, right? So you want to have to go into them, get an item, and then need to use that item to leave. We have the idea of gate rooms, which are the room you place between the part of the dungeon you can access now and the part of the dungeon you want to be able to access next, right? And so these block your passage without the associated item. these are where you have to be really careful that the new items you add to the game can't sequence break your previous gates unless you want them to. So these are the ones that you have to double check to make sure they still work, that you're not passable without the specific items that you chose for them. And then we can have things like challenge rooms, which can appear in areas where you're guaranteed to have the associated item. And so they're an opportunity to express mastery, right? And they're intended to be fun. You get to assume the player has the associated item, so you can build really cool stuff around that specific item and its interactions with the world. But you can also use other items to sort of aid your way through them. Because if the game is just assuming you have the item, it doesn't mean you can't use other stuff to get through it. So here you can see a character using a grappling hook to get through this space a little bit faster than they might have if they only had double jump. These specialized rooms are also great because you're spending more time customizing fewer rooms, which lets you do cooler stuff with them. So gate rooms, as I just showed, can kind of act as signposts. And in a Metroidvania game where you're going to be wandering all over the place and getting lost, it's nice to have things that guide you in the correct direction. And sometimes you want to do this kind of subtly, right? My current double jump gate looks like this, again, because I've been spending all my time making slides. But you might remember this room from your playthrough of Super Metroid or earlier in the talk when I mentioned that some rooms should be memorable, right? I find this room very memorable. It's the only one where you walk through the mouth of a creepy creature and its saliva drips on you. But it's nice because you can run into this room right before you get the high jump boots. And then it sticks in your memory as like, oh, there was this weird exit in this weird room that looks completely different, has a completely different tile set, and a place that's too high up for me to reach, and immediately realize that you're supposed to go back there. And so we can do the same thing. We can make custom stuff that only exists in these gate rooms and use them as signposts for the player. Another topic that I actually get asked about a lot in terms of building enough content for a game like this is the idea of flipping rooms. So if you have a room and it looks like this normally, we can flip it over the y-axis, and in theory, we can double our room count, right? The problem is, this is really doubling it for your generator. It's not really a doubling for your players, because your players probably aren't going to care that you have twice as many rooms in your game if half of them are just mirrors of the other half. It's really useful when you have very, very few rooms. So we talked about these specialized rooms, like this double jump gate where you come in from the left and leave to the right. If you don't want to have to build two versions of that in both directions to make your generator happy, you can just flip it, right? And this leads to some questions, like, can you just flip the whole room? Can you take the whole room and rotate it 180 degrees or something? What happens to stuff that shouldn't be flippable, like text? If you have a building with a sign on it and you rotate your room, that sign is now going to be backwards and it's going to be really strange. The other question is, how does flipping change generation? So the subunits and the openings in the room also change position and orientation when you flip it. So you have to make sure that you're handling that flip correctly in terms of the generator data. And all of this means you're going to have bugs. And you should probably write specialized flipping logic that lives in exactly one spot that's responsible for taking a room template and flipping it and treating them as entirely separate room templates. And you should build a way to visually identify these flipped rooms, because if you're anything like me, you're going to run into weird esoteric problems with dungeon generation where it keeps failing and you can't figure out why. And then after hours and hours of struggling with it, you're going to realize, oh, it's just a flipped room and my flipping code is wrong. The last thing I want to talk about is, we mentioned that we wanted to have separate zones in this world map, but we just said we want to really optimize the amount of time we spend working on rooms so we get the biggest bang for our buck, right? So all of the item-related rooms that we mentioned just now kind of need to work in every zone, because otherwise we have to build them all again for every zone we want to build or add to the game. And so our goal here is to change the way the room feels without changing the mechanics. So here's kind of a room that doesn't have any zone stuff applied to it. It has like a debug texture. So the first thing we can do is swap out the tile set. So I have a shader that I'll show on the next slide that basically takes a material and takes these tiles and looks up a different sprite atlas for them and makes them look different. So in this case, kind of like a stone path texture and then some blue rocks. And you can basically recolor or redraw all of the stuff in the room without changing its mechanics. we can place background doodads and, background elements and doodads, in this case, like a snow texture that can overlay on top of the terrain to make it feel colder and more icy. We can add environmental effects, things like these snow particles. We could do things like color grading or adding music or sound effects that, again, change the way the room feels without actually changing how it behaves. And just because we don't want to remake all of our item rooms for every zone doesn't mean we can't make zone-specific content. We could add different enemy types to these rooms that only show up there. We could also build zone-specific rooms with unique mechanics, like slippery floors or updrafts in a really windy area or something. And as long as they don't rely on a particular item to work, we can sort of mix and match those zone rooms with the item rooms, with our normal big set of rooms, and get something that feels like it was specifically built around an item and like a zone theme, but is really just combinations of these different sets of rooms. We can also change the way that zones feel by tweaking the generator parameters. Like I said, the generator is really responsible for the size and shape and stuff. So like if we want a zone that feels like a vertical corridor that you always enter from the top and then go downwards in, that's a problem for the generator to deal with. And just real quick, I wanted to show off this cool tile set replacement shader. I would love to do a talk just about optimizing tiles in Unity and getting them to do cool stuff. I have so many tile classes, but I figured I would just show you guys this. It's like you can set the vertex color on a tile in its class and then look up that vertex color in a shader and apply it to a different sprite atlas so that we can use literally the same tiles across all of our different rooms, but apply different textures to them. So here's stuff that I'm thinking about for the future of this game. I'm thinking about generating those zone variants, so figuring out ways to place the doodads and the background elements and background textures and all that stuff so that I don't have to do it by hand for every zone, and so that it can be different in every zone, so it's not just a palette swap. I need to think about how many rooms is enough for the different items, for the normal, like, big set of rooms in the dungeon, and for zone-specific rooms and things like that. I'm thinking about ways to design generic rooms that are fun with multiple items. So you saw that challenge room. It was kind of fun to go through it with the grappling hook and the double jump. The general rooms that are usable no matter what items you have should also be pretty fun to move through with different items and give the player some interesting ways to experiment and to have those items affect the movement through the world in a meaningful way, even in spaces that weren't specifically designed for them. And I'm trying to figure out how to balance working on the generator with building the content for the game, because you kind of have to do both. I think there's a section in Tanya Short's book about procedural generation in games that's specifically about, like, for your game to feel like it's getting a lot better, you need the generator and your content to both get better at the same time and have this, like, combinational explosion. And it's hard to do that when you're working at it all yourself. So, like, I don't know how to hire someone to help me build rooms for this thing. If people have ideas for how to do that, I'd be happy to hear it, because I'm running out of bandwidth to be doing all the things all at the same time, and I'm not that good at designing rooms. So yeah, thank you for watching. This was my talk on room design for procedural Metroidvanias. Thank you for hanging out. If people have questions, I'm going to catch my breath and drink some tea because my voice is going out. Oops. You can also come hang out with us on the ProcJam server and make some games, and we'll help you out. Yeah, I think there were like 50-something unique graphics for this presentation, because ADHD Brain was like, there needs to be a picture on every slide or no one will pay attention. And I realized that that just means I won't pay attention, but I'm glad that y'all appreciate all the pictures. Does anybody have questions specifically about either room designs or about... Oh, Alan delivered a cat who's very concerned about being here. She's not used to being on camera. He looks very grumpy. Well, you said there must be cat, so now there is cat. How would I make a generator with a fixed narrative in mind? I mean, there's a game that did that, right? That's Chasm, right? They tried to make a procedural Metroidvania with a very specific narrative in mind, so a specific set of items that you're going to get from the start to the finish. If you mean it, yeah, if you mean a narrative that's specifically about like a more less of a gameplay narrative and more of like a thematic, like a story narrative. I realize that narrative means story. I use narrative in very overloaded ways. I'm sorry. It means a lot of different things to different people. If I were making a game about falling down, what I would probably do that mostly in the generator. So I would design most of my rooms to be fun to move from the top to the bottom. I would have some rooms that are about moving left and right in that space. And I would tweak the generator to specifically prefer like moving downwards over other directions, which would overall just kind of sculpt the dungeon in a downwards direction. Excuse me. Are you making allowances for periods of the game that will lock behind you, forcing you to do sections of looking at it for a power-up before it permits backtracking? Yes, that's already in the generator. I'm not specifically causing it to happen, but it is allowed in that when you're on the path to an item, the backwards exits along that path can actually be up to the level of the item that you're on that path to get, right? So you can fall down a hole that's too high to get back up, and then you can go off and get that item. And that is nice because that is a really loose constraint, right? It doesn't really restrict the dungeon a whole bunch. But I could definitely do something like enforce that happens at some point. To do that, you need to have barriers that only block in one direction. I have a lot of stuff to say about how to build an actual generator for this, including the fact that openings are sort of bi-directional by design, right? They can block your entry into a room and your exit from the room. And so if you want to have something that you can go through one way and then be blocked until you get something else and then come back, you need to handle those two-way things. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. A little side quest. Talk about going up makes you think about Mario's clear pipes or bouncy trampolines. Mario is a great example of keeping the like movement mechanics simple, but making your room design better and your level design better and giving you lots of options within the same level that don't depend on those items. And I think that, and Celeste does the same thing, right? Each of the zones in the game, each of the levels in the game has new stuff for you to interact with. And as you get towards the end of the game, they start mixing and matching, right? And so definitely I think that building rooms around a core concept that isn't an item and mixing and matching those with the actual rooms that are built around a progression item can give you some really cool combinatorial effects, even if you're not mixing them all in the same room. Later zones don't necessarily need all of the items to complete just to get to. Yeah, so the idea is that really what matters is unlocking more of the world as you get items, right? So once you've unlocked the world, what I realize is I don't really want to be super restrictive on where the player can go. What I want to do is encourage this narrative, right? And like sequence breaking is fine. It's fun. If people want to sequence break your game, that could be a way for them to express mastery. And I plan to incentivize it and reward it. But you want to make sure that it doesn't confuse people who weren't intending to do it, right? You don't want someone to get stuck in a place that they can't get back from because they didn't have, they happened to get through an opening in one direction that they shouldn't have been able to, and then they can't get back, right? So it's kind of a balancing act. I'm still figuring out how to actually implement that. Challenge rooms in general are those like lesser constraints so that they're giving you opportunities to use all those cool items that you had without having to design, combination rooms for like double jump and dash, right? Because making a separate set of rooms for every combination of 2 or 3 or 4 items in the game would be a nightmarishly impossible task. Like that's not a thing I could ever do on my own and wouldn't really want to ask somebody else to do it for me. Oh my God, I'm still out of breath. If people want, I could do a talk on like the actual like dungeon generation side of this. By nature, it would be a little bit more technical. It's very hard to talk about dungeon generation without talking about things like constraint solvers and rules and like iterative versus recursive programming and all that stuff. And I felt like the lessons from this talk would be the most like generally useful for other people who like, kind of already have a generator but are trying to figure out how to make it work in these different contexts. I also am realizing that the strategies that I'm using here of the two big things of that like non-Euclidean traversal between rooms while still having them in a fixed grid, and like exits that can be smoothly and cleanly removed, would probably be really helpful in making some like really cool randomizers. So the Super Metroid and Celeste randomizers both, there are versions that will generate like that will take the rooms in the game and put them together back in a random order. But it's a really hard task because you're placing these like arbitrarily shaped rooms with arbitrary exits into a fixed grid, and it doesn't work super well. It's very easy for you to have collisions. And so some of those techniques, I don't know, maybe I'll get into randomizer design or find some of the randomizers and see if we can collaborate on something. It would require changing the rooms. Like you would have to redesign some of them to have optional exits where they aren't there right now, and to make some of the exits mandatory or optional. But it seems like it might be able to do some really cool stuff. Oh, that's a big question. Yeah, the generator is absolutely like, again, this is sort of a topic for an entire talk. The generator that I have built is, I guess, kind of a modified constraint solver written by someone who's never used a constraint solver. But it's the way it works is it essentially follows the optimal path of the player through this Metroidvania dungeon and builds just enough to ensure that sort of Metroidvania narrative. Then it goes back and builds the branches, so places that you could go that aren't necessarily the right way but have bonus stuff. And then it goes through and adds like even more optional stuff like individual leaf rooms and secrets and all that kind of thing. And then it goes through and caps everything and finishes off all the constraints to like finalize. So take this option space of all of these rooms that are partially constrained and then squish them all down into one actual dungeon. And like following the path of the player is extremely useful because you're only constraining the things that are really important to that. It means that my dungeon relies on the openings that are in the room template and that are available to be able to build the rest of the dungeon. And so it was a little challenging for a while until I realized that like I had to build it in such a way that the generator would work with a really tiny set of rooms. And the room specialization stuff and the modular rooms are really, really useful because the set of rooms that I need to generate a dungeon like, you know, like this one, right? Like each of those shapes that you see here, like the single rooms and the long vertical ones and the long horizontal ones are like exactly one. There's like one room of each, right? And then one for each item room, one for adapters for the items. Like it's a really, really, really tiny set. And that is really nice for developing both the rooms and the generator at the same time because I don't have to build 100 rooms to get a generator that feels good. Cool. Well, my voice is starting to hurt. Thank you all for hanging out and listening to me talk about dungeon design. I'll do something like this again. Probably not super soon. I could use a break to actually build some rooms. But yeah, thanks a lot. Again, come hang out with us on Discord. Send me a message. Ask me about building Metroidvanias. I'll catch y'all later. Bye.